Thank you, Theo. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome to new attendance at Centre for Yoga Studies, SOAS. It gives me great pleasure this evening, or this morning, or whatever time it is, wherever you are, to introduce Professor Loriliai Biernacki, whom I've met at various wonderful conferences over the years. Last time, I think, was at the Tantric Studies Conference in Flagstaff, if I recall rightly. Is that correct? Yeah. Seems like a different yuga, doesn't it? It was only a couple of years ago, but many things have happened since then, as we all know. So the Lorelai's official, Professor Biernacki's official bio is that she teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I haven't been to. So any chance to invite one, I'd love to go when we're allowed to travel again, because it sounds like an amazing place, Boulder. It's definitely on my bucket list. And lots of exciting scholarship going on there, particularly in the realm of Tantra, Lorelai's speciality. But her research interests also include Hinduism, gender, and the interface between religion and science. Her first book, Renowned Goddess of Desire, Women, Sex and Speech in Tantra, which was published in 2007, won the Caden Award. She's also the co-editor of God's Body, Panentheism Across the World's Religious Traditions. And of course, that's relevant to what she's going to be talking about today. And Professor Biernacki is completing a study on the 11th century Indian philosopher Abhinav Gupta within the framework of wonder, again, what we're hearing about today. Wonder, the new materialisms and conceptions of the body-mind interface. Now, in addition to that academic biography, I have to say I was looking her up earlier and I was excited to read this other bit, which I can't help but read out as well, that Professor Biernacki grew up in the deep rural South in Louisiana, imbibing the hot, humid summers full of lazy afternoons, swimming in the creeks amidst the local alligators. So, I'm sure she can fend off any questions we might have for her. I will be chairing the questions at the end. As Theo said, please submit them on Slido. So with that, over to you, Lorelai, and you're going to be talking to us. Well, the title we had was Wonder and Being in a Body, but I think you've expanded upon that somewhat. So please, the stage is all yours.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen then. Here we go. Let's see. Sure. Okay. So the matter of wonder, Abhinav Gupta's panentheism and new materialism, and I have a little epigraph for the talk here. This comes from the Paratrimsika Vivarana, and this quote is: "The I, which is wonder, and the word here is chamatkara, is the self of all that appears. The I is the spontaneous, innate power, the mantra of the highest goddess of speech. As it is said, the essence of all visible phenomena rests within the I feeling. This is a secret beyond all secrets." Okay, so that's the epigraph for this. For my talk today, I will address the topic of wonder, chamatkara. I'll read selections here from a book I have coming out next year with Oxford. The book is titled Abhinav Gupta's Panentheism and New Materialism. And what I read here comes from the second chapter of this book. And the second chapter is called The Matter of Wonder. So let's see, here we go. Okay, so drawing from the 11th century India, from Abhinav Gupta, who many of you have no doubt already heard of, I suggest a distinctive interpretation of wonder that links wonder not to transcendence outside the body and matter, but instead to an awareness of subjectivity within matter and materiality. So this brilliant thinker, Abhinav Gupta, was instrumental in philosophizing medieval India's tantric shift, and a part of this tantric rearticulation of the self involved reclaiming the body as a key component of tantric praxis. So what I'm reading comes from the second chapter of this book, the eponymous chapter called The Matter of Wonder. I will read mostly from three sections of this chapter: on wonder as a sensory experience, also on wonder as the will, and wonder as the idea of transcending inwardly, as opposed to the up and out that we find in various yoga traditions and in Shankar's Advaita Vedanta. I'll also talk a little bit about, I'll cover a little bit of this, a section on time as well also. So this chapter, The Matter of Wonder, has 6 sections. I won't cover them all, but I will give you a sense here of what they talk about. So the 6 sections cover: first, wonder as a category, particularly for the West. I won't go over that very much. 2, the sensory appeal of wonder. I'll talk a little bit about that. The 3rd section covers the idea in Abhinav Gupta that wonder is essentially linked to matter. We can only have wonder where we have matter and materiality. Wonder is particularly about linking matter to subjectivity. Okay, so the 4th section covers the idea that wonder is tied to the will, to a capacity for intentionality. What this ultimately means is that matter does have agency. Okay, so the 5th section covers the idea that Abhinav Gupta understands the transcendent feeling we get in a state of wonder is not a kind of moving up and out, but instead it's rather a movement inwards to the I. So it's about moving from and I suggest this is about moving from a 3rd person perspective to a 1st person perspective. And then this last section is on time. I'll talk a little, bring in a little bit of this. I argue here in this section that Abhinav reincorporates the idea of time back into the idea of transcendence. Now, this is really the opposite reading of what we usually think of as transcendence. And this, I think Abhinav Gupta's insight is really profound here, and it can add to our current understanding today. And this is ultimately how Abhinav Gupta bridges the mind-body gap. Okay, so that's basically the gist of this. And so my main argument for the talk goes something like this. So, and I'll just talk a little bit here and then move into this. So for us in the West today, and for Abhinav Gupta, the feeling of wonder is understood and interpreted through a phenomenology. Wonder as a state of mind seems to propose a heightened transcendence. It brings us up and outside our ordinary sense of self. We feel wonder in the face of a beautiful web of sunset colors over the mountains. And Jim, maybe you'll get to see those sunset colors over the mountains at some point. Or we feel wonder in a speechless apprehension of the vastness of planets in the starry sky beyond our human ability to map it. That is, we think of wonder as a kind of transcendence. I won't go into much depth here today on Western conceptions of wonder, except to highlight here how the idea of wonder has been co-opted by science today. So in this chapter, I discuss a TED talk by neuroscientist Anil Seth, where he disabuses us of the idea that we might have a soul by telling the audience that it's our brains hallucinate consciousness. We may think that we see and hear and touch the world around us, but really consciousness, our intimate sense of self, these are simply what he calls a, quote, a controlled hallucination generated by the brain. In other words, consciousness is a product of the brain. Recognizing that rhetorically punchy language like hallucination, that's his term, that it might be, a term like this might be off-putting, Seth concludes his talk by offering us the sense of wonder. Now, this is curious, and this is something we see across a spectrum of scientists. Even as Seth, with one hand, takes away our familiar comforting anchor, a soul, which can offer meaning to us in the chaos of life. So even as he takes us away, with the other hand, he gives us a consolation meant to replace our loss, which is, he tells us, the feeling of wonder. And not just Seth, from Carl Sagan's, this is a quote from Carl Sagan, science arouses a soaring sense of wonder, to Scientific American, we find this pattern repeated again and again with scientists. We might ask, why is it that wonder is the term one invokes when trying to sell a non-enchanted, a non-religious worldview? Why has wonder become the go-to consolation prize for the loss of some greater power in the universe, a soul, a God? Why? I suggest it's phenomenology of transcendence. Wonder brings us outside our small, ordinary sense of self, opening into something bigger, beyond self, outside of our small self. The vastness of the starry sky, the rich web of sunset colors over the mountains, or wonder in the face of the mind-boggling complexity of the human immune system, wonder offers this transcendence without the religious strings attached. Anil Seth draws on this trope, and Scientific American's coupling of, quote, meaning the big picture with wonder makes the link explicit. Okay, so for this chapter in Abhinav Gupta, I give 6 key themes, okay? So the first key theme here is that what Abhinav Gupta offers to the mix is to radically rewrite the idea of transcendence. He urges us to recognize that the power of wonder is not really that it offers a transcendence that leaves behind a wretched earthbound materiality. Rather, wonder instead brings us back to matter. Only the difference here, though, is that in a state of wonder, our vision of matter is altered. We recognize its own liveliness, its own subjectivity. That is, wonder reminds us that the sense of I, the self, is lodged at the very heart of matter. When we experience wonder, we tap into the secret sharing of subjectivity. Here we wind up with an intuitively astute insight. The feeling of transcendence that wonder appears to elicit depends on a deeper, if mostly neglected and unarticulated materiality. So Abhinav Gupta's conceptualization helps us reconstruct a notion of transcendence that can avoid a pervasive trap of transcendence, what Thomas Nagel calls a view from nowhere. That is, the idea that we might somehow transcend to a universal true reality perspective that encompasses all views above the fray. So that's the first key theme. The second key theme is Abhinav Gupta's model links wonder to subjectivity. He locates the transcendence that wonder offers always within an I, with its particular first-person embodied perspective. In Abhinav Gupta's formulation, wonder is just simply the expression of the I, the self within matter. Moreover, I suggest it makes sense as well to read the invocation of wonder on the part of a scientist like Anil Seth along the lines that Abhinav Gupta articulates. Though not voiced by Seth, I suggest that the appeal wonder has for scientists like him and others is also tied to its reclamation of subjectivity. Okay, so tied to this is a third theme. The third key theme is that wonder is precisely the mix of subject and object, a sense of I located within materiality. This mix of subject and object, this is what it means to be sentient, okay? We are both subject and object. Where things are alive, mixing matter and consciousness, there we find wonder. Wonder for Abhinav Gupta's philosophy of recognition, the pratyabhijna, simply is what reveals the bond between matter and subjectivity. This for us may seem counterintuitive. From our vantage point, and we're coming out of our Cartesian sort of philosophy here in the West, subjectivity is linked to consciousness. That's how we think of it. And as such, it's unlike matter as it can possibly be. This stark divide is precisely what Abhinav Gupta aims to overturn with his panentheism. He nudges us towards a materiality underwritten by consciousness. To put this another way, wonder is a phenomenological portal that helps us to see that at the base of everything is this sense of I. That is, subjectivity is what holds up everything. So that's the third key theme. Now, the fourth key theme brings us back to transcendence. Abhinav Gupta refigures the idea of transcendence using yogic states and practices around the breath. Abhinav connects the upward moving breath to the fourth state, Turiya, a state classically in India connected with the idea of transcendence. Here, however, Abhinav links this meditative state not to the up and out of the body that we usually associate with transcendence. Instead, he figures it as a movement inward to a deeper sense of subjectivity. Okay, so this brings us to our fifth key theme. He thwarts as well one other truism we tie to transcendence, and that is we usually imagine transcendence as a space of timelessness. Above the change and flux of the world, Abhinava instead rewrites time back into the transformed notion of transcendence. Okay, and there's a sixth key theme, which I won't really cover here, which is linking to wonder to matter changes the ball game. Matter becomes a very different kind of thing. This, I suggest, offers in particular a novel analysis that can help us to really think differently about what matter is. So back to our first key point, his take on wonder also reconfigures the basis of transcendence, pointing to its dependence on the very thing it transcends. That is, transcendence depends upon matter. And with this, we find a tantric panentheism that discovers a first-person perspective, not only in our own self-aware thoughts, but also an enlivening force embedded within the matter and bodies, the matter of bodies and objects. Okay, so in what follows for the talk then, I'll first point to the Indian genealogy of wonder traced in the science of cooking and the sensory embodied element of wonder. Okay, then I'll skip a section on the link wonder has to matter, and then discuss Abhinav Gupta's suggestion that wonder is tied to an expression of the will. With this, Abhinav links wonder to its capacity for agency and an intentional stance. This logic affords a sense of agency within matter, where wonder is precisely the mix of subject and object, a sense of I located within materiality. This mix of subject and object, this is what it means to be sentient. I mentioned this earlier, this is a key point, where things are alive, mixing matter and consciousness, that's where we find wonder. After this, we will look at how Abhinav Gupta refigures the idea of transcendence using yogic states and practices around the breath. Abhinav connects the upward moving breath to the fourth state, a state classically in India connected with the idea of transcendence. Here, however, Abhinav links this meditative state not to the up and out of the body that we usually associate with transcendence. Instead, he figures it as a movement inward to a deeper sense of subjectivity. And then I'll also talk a tiny bit about the idea of time and how Abhinav Gupta rewrites time back into this transformed notion of transcendence. So let's begin now with wonder's culinary origins. So not like Aristotle's understanding of wonder as a goad to knowledge, Abhinav's Indian context finds wonder, Chamatkara's origins more prosaically in the science of cooking. Pakashastra, the science of cooking, gives us the verbal root chum, tasting or sipping, as the onomatopoeic clicking of the tongue when we taste something delicious. So, and Abhinav Gupta ties wonder as well. Abhinav also ties wonder as well to its verbal root chum as tasting, a sensory enjoyment. He tells us wonder indeed rests in its own nature without depending on some other thing. In this way, it has the form of enjoyment as tasting. That's the Sanskrit here. Now he also, and in the same passage, he also tells us wonder is abiding in the taste of enjoyment without any obstruction. Okay, so I give the whole passage here, and I won't dwell on this for the sake of time. Okay, so wonder is a gustatory experience. Especially, it is an unbridled sensory experience without any obstruction, as he tells us. I imagine here he means by this that the mind, with its capacity to intervene with a running dialogue in most of our states of life, is actually silenced in the state of wonder. No mental chatter to obstruct the taste of enjoyment. Sensual and sensory, it points back to that early childhood joy that comes with being in a body, savoring the taste of food. Elsewhere again, when Abhinav describes how we tell the difference between things that are alive, like us, and things that are insentient, like crystals and the color blue, he points again to wonder. And here also, wonder is about physical and sensory enjoyment. So the quote here is that sentience, which is free, not dependent on some other, that is the I, actively reflecting on its own self as the one who enjoys. This gives rise to wonder, which is the nature of unbroken sensory enjoyment. So again, we got this idea that wonder, which is subjectivity here, is the nature of an unbroken sensory enjoyment. So wonder is an unbroken sensory enjoyment, again, sidestepping the mind's tendency to chop up and distract us from our experiences. Wonder instead arises when the I actively engages its own sensual pleasure. We may find this surprising in that this take on wonder is so closely tied to the senses. Abhinava's wonder refuses a transcendence that drops the body while it reaches for the clouds. Nevertheless, I suggest Abhinava's formulation points to a fine-grained attention to the phenomenology of wonder. Wonder arises precisely when we reflect inwardly, speechless as we ingest, indeed taste, a reality beyond our habitual limitations. We can already see hints reshaping the idea of transcendence away from a more familiar notion that takes us up and out of the body. Instead, wonder brings us more intimately back into ourselves, drinking in the enjoyment of an inward subjectivity. Keep in mind in this context, the inherent nature of all things, matter, our bodies, it's still consciousness, but we can and do notice a difference between you or I, or a dog that barks, and things that are not alive, a clay jar or a crystal. What does wonder do? Wonder is what signals the difference that comes with being alive. Tied to the idea of being alive, Abhinav Gupta sees in wonder another aspect, a capacity for freedom, when he says above, this is the quote you see above, in its own nature without depending on some other thing. Wonder does not happen when we are fearful of some outcome or chasing some desired goal. It happens when the self is not driven by some other element determining one's behavior, not mechanical or rote. Sentience entails a genuine freedom, free from external constraints. This is precisely what defines us as separate from mere matter. We can taste, enjoy embodied experience in a way that a mere machine or simple insentient matter cannot. That is, sentience means precisely being able to push back against the kind of mechanical determinism that dominates matter. Of course, much biological science, for instance, Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, imposed just this sort of determinism on humans, biological algorithms that render human freedom a simple Darwinian fiction. And Abhinav Gupta also acknowledges limitations on human freedom to choose. Certainly, this capacity for freedom that comes with subjectivity exists on a gradated scale. Humans tend to be partially free and partially not, mostly trapped in Maya, what we might style the algorithms of karma. The degree to which we can immerse ourselves in the subjectivity of wonder signals our freedom. This freedom is precisely our capacity to transcend the determinism of insentience. Thus, for Abhinava, wonder is not about advocating a human exceptionalism. Rather, wonder is the sign of being alive because it points to a freedom that comes from being able to choose. It is subjectivity writ large, not bound to a particular species. It's a subjectivity on which humans have no special claim. I would venture that Anil Seth and Scientific American are both also invoking a similar logic, linking wonder to subjectivity, if not explicitly. They offer wonder as the consolation prize for the hard truth of our mechanistic reality. Why? Precisely because it reclaims our human subjectivity. Even if the biological algorithms driving our brains produce only hallucinations, the illusion of free will, produces only hallucinations, the illusion of free will, still the experience of wonder gives us back a sense of subjectivity. And that subjectivity frees us from the plight of insentient, algorithmically driven matter. This subjectivity tells us we are alive. And some of you guys might also be thinking here of Descartes as well. It will not be surprising then to see the extensive role wonder Chamatkara plays also in Abhinav Gupta's writings on aesthetics. Abhinava, in his philosophical text, the Ishvara Pratyabhijna Vivriti Vimarshini, explicitly connects this unbroken sensory enjoyment of wonder that we saw above to aesthetic experience. He tells us, in the aesthetic experience of poetry and dance, etc., also there is the absence of obstacles, which again, this sort of lack of obstacles, which are the nature of the constraints that arise in the inward functions of the mental stuff. That act of tasting, in fact, is the essence of rasa, which is stated elsewhere as wonder. The rapturous transcendence we get from being absorbed in a gripping performance in beautiful poetry comes about because we move inwardly without obstacles, inwardly into a wondrous and unrestrained sensory enjoyment. Okay, so I'll skip a section here on the connection between wonder and matter. However, a key point is that as a phenomenological experience, wonder arises precisely when the sense of I finds itself mixing with the materiality of the world. Utpaladeva, Abhinav Gupta's grand guru, articulates this saying, the one who takes the form of the world, the great Lord, who is the universal self, within all beings, expands open in wonder, which is the mixture of the unbroken subject and the unbroken object. Okay, note here this repeated use of this word unbroken, which I suggest points to what Abhinav was saying as well about the phenomenology of wonder, that it's unbroken, that it's this continuous state. Okay. So wonder happens with just this mixture of subject and object, the I embodied within materiality. The rest of the passage reads, that one is the primary state sought after, the fourth state beyond waking, dream, and deep sleep states. We'll come to the fourth state later. Here we might note that the easy assimilation of divinity to a state of mind. This is just sort of an interesting quality of this passage. The effortless slide from the great Lord as the one seamlessly into a particular state of mind available to every living being. This is a recurrent theme of this Kashmiri panentheist subjectivity. I discussed this earlier in the book, but won't go into it here. Okay, in any case, there's just one reality, that is the I. Okay, this substratum of subjectivity takes on a great variety of forms, becoming all the different subjects, all awakening into this cosmic sentience to call themselves I. So Abhinav Gupta tells us explicitly, the I, which is the nature of pure awareness, constantly pervading the whole, is capable of manifesting with duality. Okay. So I'll move on to another section here, talking about the idea of the will, which are, and it's called the wonder of the will, the intentions of matter. I point out that Abhinav Gupta's characterization of wonder goes deeper than a mere emotion, offering a different hermeneutic than a familiar Western characterization of wonder as a cognitive emotion. Instead, Abhinav understands wonder in terms of will, and he tells us, everywhere, in fact, it is the case that wonder is only just the will. And elaborating further, he tells us, will is everywhere defined as resting in one's own self in the form of enjoyment. This enjoyment indeed is the state of wonder. Wonder, with its freedom to choose, is at base a capacity to will something. It carries an intentionality rooted in a self reveling in the taste of its own subjectivity. It may perhaps appear surprising to link wonder to the will. Again, wonder for us is steeped in a history of Western philosophy, seems to call up a state where the idea of will is suspended, an indeterminacy that might be antithetical to the idea of will and choice. Wonder, after all, stops thought. What Abhinav Gupta's attention to the phenomenology of wonder highlights is that we typically understand choice only on the level of the mind, what this Indian tradition terms vikalpa, the kind of mental determination that makes distinctions between one thing and another. For Abhinav, on the other hand, the will is not this superficial mental capacity to distinguish between two things. His insight is that the motive power of will is an intentional stance, phenomenologically grounded in a deeper embodied subjectivity. Located before the mental activity of mind, wonder points to a deep-seated willing, an awareness of self as intentionally directed. So not so much about an Augustinian conception of willpower to choose good over evil. This notion of will points to a more primal intention, not tied to an already defined individual. The will points to an opening to world arising out of being an I, a particular first-person orientation located in a particular time and place, even for a mute insect. Indeed, Abhinav tells us, when those beings belonging to Maya, even down to an insect, when they do their own deeds, that which is to be done first stirs in the heart. This sense of subjectivity, this I-ness, is always near, present to oneself in the heart as the place where the sense of I arises. This subjectivity takes on different forms, certainly with greater or lesser capacities, yet the phenomenological perspective of the sense of I is what grounds the various entities that exist. This idea of will ties into the problem of free will as well. This Indian conception of selfhood, much like our own today, certainly recognizes the limitations put upon us by bodies. We think today in terms of neuronal conditioning, societal conditioning, which leaves us very much as products determined by our world, by the algorithms fed to us through social media, for instance. This Indian model also accepts limitations imposed by bodily forms and as a product of social, and for this medieval milieu, also karmic conditions. However, Abhinavagupta argues against a Dennett-like conception of selfhood, which denies any sense of free will. Rather, he understands commonsensical expressions of free choice as a concomitant component of the first-person perspective, and consequently, wherever one finds it, even in the insect that scurries away from the heavy boot. It is wonder which is tied to being in a body that helps us be free from the algorithms of social conditioning. In this respect, Abhinavagupta's embrace of agency, a freedom connected to subjectivity, contradicts India's better known Advaitin philosopher Shankara. As Taneshwar Tamalsena points out, at the level of the Brahman, Shankara wastes no time in discarding this autonomous agent, as the very concept of agency is a product of ignorance, avidya, that needs to be shunned. This, I suggest, is the hazard of a third-person ontology. As Lynn Rudder Baker points out, getting rid of the idea of self, as Dennett does, is actually quite consistent. If ontological naturalism is true, then ontological subjectivity is an oxymoron, and one has to become an eliminativist like Dennett in order to be consistent. Yet, what makes us distinct as persons is precisely our phenomenal experience, the feeling that our own consciousness really does feel real. Further, Baker, then Rudder Baker, and Dan Arnold as well, both point out that while Daniel Dennett proposes mapping brain states to instances that involve a first-person viewpoint, there always remains a residue of first-personal perspective that cannot be reduced or eliminated. I think it may be fair to suggest that Abhinava was aware of these sorts of problems with a third-person perspective. I suspect, however, that the link that Abhinava posits between wonder and the will is only partly driven by a close introspective attention to the phenomenology of wonder. Certainly, phenomenologically connecting it to the will locates wonder on a more primal level of consciousness than emotion or thought. But linking wonder to will does something else. It indicates agency. It means that the I is able to do things in the world. Unlike the rarefied transcendental I, reminiscent of a Cartesian duality, Abhinava's notion of the I is an agent, a kartra, rather than simply a knower. Wonder functions to enable a capacity to be in the world, to act, to affect the physical world. Here, Abhinava pushes back against an earlier widespread philosophical dualism, Sankhya theory, which, like the Cartesian separation of mind and matter, posits a self incapable of crossing over into the realm of materiality. So in Abhinavagupta's Tantrasara, he tells us, Sankhya, however, does not accept that the self could be an I consisting of active, materially engaged awareness, vimarsha. We, however, acknowledge that the self does entail a capacity to do things. That is the pure active awareness, which is the I in the form of unimpeded wonder of one's own self. Wonder ties the self to matter. It is directly linked with the capacity to do things in the world of matter. Wonder is thus the signpost of genuine free will. This is, after all, what it means to be sentient, to be able to actually freely choose one action over another in a way that affects the outcome events on a material level. Elsewhere, Abhinavagupta tells us, even those detached yogis who have the highest level of pure consciousness are not able to do things at the highest level. This is because the I, which is wonder and bliss, the supreme goal of freedom, defined by abiding in one's own self, that is covered over for them. Okay, so I have a little bit of a footnote here, but I won't go over that either in the slide. Even a great enlightened yogi, detached from desires and aversions enough not to have to experience the results of previous karma, still, even with such great awareness, such a being can lack a capacity to do things. Wonder is tied to the ability to do things. When it is hidden, covered over, then one loses the freedom to choose one thing over another, and with this, the ability to affect changes in the world. So we see wonder as the essence of matter, and wonder is connected to a capacity to do things. The logic here operates on a principle that sees activity in the world as the outcome of the movements of material bodies with material effects. This logic is not so foreign to our own. Our contemporary understanding of matter follows this understanding of material causality as connected to material effects also. It makes sense. What Abhinav does, which is so surprising, is to tie this logic of materiality to a foundational subjectivity. This pushes up against our habitual Cartesian expectations. We think of matter as one thing and the inner sense of subjectivity as completely unlike it. Descartes' res extensa and res cogitans are the two types of things that make up reality. They do not mix. For Abhinav, instead, wonder is precisely the place where they mix. With this, he then assimilates material causality to subjectivity as one of its capacities. That is, the pure I can affect the material world. All good and well, we start to see why he links wonder to the will. It is, however, in the corollary implication that we start to see the very radical implications of Abhinav's phenomenology of wonder, particularly for our world today. If wonder is the very essence of matter and wonder is linked to agency, then this means matter as well contains within it a capacity for agency. Abhinav Gupta's agential wonder begins to sound like Karen Barrett's formulations of Niels Bohr's quantum theory, where even on a quantum level for particles, we get agency. This is, of course, exactly what Abhinav needs to assert a non-dualism. We should not forget that his non-dualism is framed within a theology. Everything is really an expression of the I, which takes on a variety of forms, that is the material world, and this I is divinity, Shiva. Matter, too, is an expression of this foundational subjectivity. Its deep nature is joy, which is just the sense of I, which shines as well in the objects we perceive. Abhinav articulates this. In this way, the I on the highest level is the body, which is the form of joy, happiness, joy and happiness, nirvriti. Its nature is the sentience, vimarsha, of that which shines in consciousness. And that which is placed upon the I, that also consists just of joy, happiness. That shines is the physical body, the breath, etc. That physical body, breath, etc., Utpaladeva tells us, is also the I. Okay, so the body, which we think of as just mere matter, is also the I. For this panentheism, we do not ever really leave behind bodies. Subjectivity, the I, is a body as well, a body consisting of joy. When things that we think of as insentient, like the physical body, when those things are in contact with the I, they also consist of the joy, that is the I. The physical body, too, is only really this joy, which it assumes when jogged into recognizing its innate subjectivity, as when we, for instance, say I, feeling ourselves to be just this particular person with arms and legs and so on, engaging in our world around us as a unified self. This inner subjectivity was always the body's own already present, if unrecognized, inner joy. This blurring of the lines between bodies and subjectivity is the insight Abhinav brings. And for Abhinav Gupta's world and for us, it pushes against what we expect. Abhinav tells us, this is the epigraph I use, the I, which is wonder, is the self of all that appears. This I is the spontaneous innate power, the mantra of the highest goddess of speech. As is said, the essence of all visible phenomena rests within the I feeling. This is a secret beyond all secrets. The experience of wonder points to a foundational subjectivity underwriting everything that appears. This subjectivity is not an impersonal, transcendental subject, Rather, it carries unembodied intentionality conveyed poetically as the spontaneous power of the goddess of speech. Okay, so we'll shift here into a section called Wonder as the Eye Transcending In. Throughout this chapter, I've been dancing around the indissoluble conjunction of wonder with subjectivity. This shows up in Abhinav Gupta's language. Variants of the compound word we see above, ahanta chamatkara, wonder which is subjectivity, wonder which is the eye, ahamiti chamatkara are repeated, okay, throughout, okay? And then just talk about some of the other examples that I give here. For us, what I suggest here is that Abhinav expressly uses wonder's simultaneous link to both subjectivity and to materiality to rewrite the notion of transcendence. For us, wonder evokes a phenomenology of transcendence. We saw this explicitly with Seth and Scientific American. Wonder frees us from the drudgery of mechanistic existence, lifting us up into something greater than our habitual selves. Abhinav's hermeneutic of wonder, on the other hand, disrupts this, not following the familiar up and out of religious transcendence where we arrive at some disembodied and timeless place. Instead, Abhinav's wonder locates transcendence within ourselves in a deeper embodied subjectivity. This model adventure may perhaps provide ways of thinking through transcendence for us today. It moves us away from an idea of transcendence as somehow referring to an outside, an independent authority, what Thomas Nagel calls the view from nowhere, a space that is somehow beyond materiality. Instead, Abhinav Gupta frames the transcendence that comes with wonder as a movement to an inwardly felt subjectivity, carrying us into a heightened first-person awareness. Here, a clarification is in order. Abhinav's link between wonder and subjectivity does not point to the sense of self that we typically construe as ego, but rather instead to a more foundational intentionality. This includes the ego, but expands beyond it. When Abhinav Gupta tells us, wonder, in fact, is just unrivaled resting in one's own self, the phenomenology of wonder is an experience of self, but this self is not our limited sense of ego. In the quote we saw in the last section, where Abhinav tells us that the self for his philosophy differs from the earlier Sankhya in that it accords agency to the self, he adds as well a defining insight. He says, the ego, ahamkara, is the person mirrored in the intellect, but stained by contact with being an object. It then imagines the self in that which is not the self, like imagining silver where there's only a shell, mother of pearl. In this way, the suffix doing in ahamkara, I doing equals the ego, indicates a state of artificially constructing the sense of self. So it's this kara here, which makes it artificial. The pure active awareness, which is the I, ahanta, that is wonder, which is one's own self. That, in fact, is not an adversary of the ego. I think that's a really important point, that it's not an adversary of the ego. Phenomenologically, what we think of ego happens later. It is artificially constructed, just as so much contemporary neuroscience and psychology also tells us. In this case, however, it is not something in opposition to the deeper self, not something apart from it, and not its adversary. So not an Augustinian model of the self divided against its higher self. Rather, the ego too takes on life from this deeper subjectivity. The transcendence that wonder brings is not about leaving behind or destroying the ego, as is so often associated with Indian spirituality. Here, instead, the ego is the refraction and reflection of a larger self. In terms, in terms of the ego and transcendence, for our own contemporary phenomenology of wonder, the intimation of something bigger than egoic identity is what ties wonder to a transcendence. This transcendence ushers in the something bigger, announces some higher reality governing how things unfold. Okay, I'm going to skip over here a section on telos and teleology and its rejection by a contemporary science because it points to something outside of matter directing it, seeming to hand wave in again through the back door, something that looks suspiciously like ideas of God pulling strings. So this section, I talk about theology that I'm skipping, and I also talk here about the use of play, krida, within Indian non-dualisms, including Abhinav Gupta and Utpaladeva, as a way to push back against the determining constraints of teleology and telos. And Abhinav Gupta and Utpaladeva's connection of play, I talk about this, which I won't go into much depth here, of their connection of play with wonder, okay? What I suggest with this is that I suspect that this idea of telos is part of what Abhinav Gupta's idea of wonder undoes, because it emphasizes the first person perspective. Okay, so again, but I won't go into much depth on that here. Okay, it is not the case, it is nevertheless, so to come back to transcendence, it is nevertheless not the case that we do not see the kind of phenomenology that we associate with transcendence also in Abhinav Gupta. We do. We see this kind of transcendence. It is rather that instead of some sort of up and out to a transcendent outside, beyond time and embodiment, he understands it in terms of a movement within to embrace the sense of I. Thus, when Abhinav describes a phenomenology akin to what we think of as transcendence, the expansive rush of moving out of our small egoic identities, here too he links it back to the body, to the breath in the body. In this case, the sense of transcendence is indeed an upward movement. It is the upward movement of the upmoving breath, udana, one of the 5 different breaths in the body. This bodily upward movement is identified with a well-known yogic state, the 4th state, turiya, a state of awareness that goes beyond the familiar 3 states of waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state. This state of transcendence happens when the up-moving breath moves into the subtle channel in the spine. So the Abhinav tells us, then due to this upward flow in the central path becoming stabilized, it is called the up-moving breath, udana. And that up-moving breath has the nature of fire, burning up the idea of duality. Consequently, it is the basis of the 4th state. We saw this 4th state earlier in Utpaladeva, describing wonder as the mix of subject and object, the I within materiality. This 4th state is generally in India understood as a state of transcendence, classically depicted as leaving behind, transcending the body. Abhinav instead points to the 4th state as moving into subjectivity, where we leave behind the idea of third person, the thisness of being an object. Poetically invoking an image of alchemy, he tells us, let me give you another slide here. But when thisness is concealed, pierced by the unifying flavor of I, then one exists, as it were, in the pure consciousness of the states called Sadashiva and Ishvara. Here, by making this non-dual perspective a habit, one experiences the 4th state, following the familiar adage of gold enveloping copper to make artificial gold. However, the feeling of transcendence is indeed an upward feeling, characterized by the flow of the upward breath. However, its function is to bring us into subjectivity, to wrap over the sense of third person thisness. By working with the mind to develop this as a general attitude of seeing the world without dualities, one then experiences the 4th state. This 4th state is a qualitatively different awareness than our perceptions in dreams, deep sleep, or waking states. And indeed, wonder as a state of mind does feel different. Additionally, he subordinates this 4th state to a 5th state, beyond the 4th state, turiyatita, which is tied to the 5th breath, a form of breath which pervades the whole body, generating a state that includes both transcendence and immanence. Describing a person in the 5th state, he tells us, however, that one in fact in this way exists in a body which contains the worlds and the principles making up reality, the tattvas. When it pervades to such an extent as to encompass the whole, then that one's inherent nature moves towards that of the supreme Shiva, experiencing the state beyond the 4th, the supreme, which is full. That is Dhyana, the all-pervading breath. The 5th breath, Dhyana, pervades the whole, not simply rising up, but encompassing both transcendence and immanence. This 5th breath pervades the body, and its accompanying state encompasses the totality of self and world. These states of mind draw on a typology familiar across yogic discourses as a description of meditative experiences in relation to commonplace understanding of waking and sleep states. Abhinav suggests in his typology of states of awareness that beyond waking, sleep, and deep sleep, it is possible to access a state of consciousness that transcends, in this case, returns to a sense of I, and also to a fifth state as well, called beyond the fourth, perhaps akin to what we call being in the zone. This fifth state includes a fullness, purnata, enveloping both subjectivity and the world. Abhinav Gupta draws on a very precise yogic phenomenology here, mapping states of consciousness in ways unfamiliar to our contemporary understanding of what the mind can experience. But rather than map a yogic state of transcendence to a phenomenon of leaving behind the body, he instead tethers it to a heightened subjectivity. The yogic practice succeeding this then brings an awareness that encompasses the fullness of the world as well. Okay, so I'm going to shift here into this last little section on time. It may also not be surprising then that Abhinav takes pains to keep time as part of the picture. The idea of transcendence as the view from nowhere, which we saw with Nagel, draws on a trope of timelessness. Abhinav pushes back against the notion of a time-free space, specifically by linking time to intentionality, the will. Intentionality, an openness, an orientation towards one thing or another, is the heart of a capacity to will. And this, he tells us, already embeds the fact of time. The crux of his argument falls back on the idea that subjectivity is foundational and all-pervasive. Even if we imagine a transcendent deity, the idea of a foundational subjectivity entails that it's located within a particular immanent I, with a specific orientation in time and space. Here, I'm reminded of Jeffrey Kripal's compelling, eloquent articulation of Eric Wargo's glass block universe, where what appears to be precognition is really the mind's natural capacity to access its own future states in earlier points in time. Also characterized by Kripal as a type of being in the zone, this sounds a lot like Abhinav Gupta's characterization of the fifth state of mind, Turyatita, an expansive awareness ontologically distinct from our usual waking awareness or sleep state. It is how yogis exercise yogic powers, including those like precognition. However, Abhinav Gupta, I suspect, would take issue with the idea of there being some sort of viewpoint that could stand above the glass block universe, looking down at it below to map the future, present, and past as if they were some frozen bit of ice or a glass block, a static, timeless rendition of the three times. Rather, the function of awareness and subjectivity means precisely that it is the I itself that moves around within this cosmopsychic glass block, not from the outside. As such, there is always this throb of movement of time within Spanda, which is the self in its own freedom. I left out an earlier section about Spanda with wonder, but in any case, quoting Somananda, he tells us that intent of will is the first instant of time. Okay, so I give the whole quote in this footnote here. So when however the creation of the Lord happens, the light spreads open in consciousness, resulting in a variety of effects in a multicolored design, then the mind stuff poised just about that intent of will is the first instant of time. So that's from the Shiva Drishti. Then he says, even the highest reality, Shiva, the energy of bliss, with the form we're unfolding is just about to happen. That energy of bliss has priority, primacy, and prior existence with regard to the energy of the will, i.e. there is sequence here as well. The word tuti is explained as a unit of time. Otherwise, in this case of sequence, how could there be states of priority and posterity? And he says that Abhinav Gupta links subjectivity to an intentional stance inextricable from time. Okay. Sure, the gifted person, a yogi, or someone coming back from a near-death experience may be able to take a larger view, encompass time from both present and future in what looks like precognition. But for Abhinav Gupta, this would not be somehow stepping outside ourselves within the glass block to then look down at it. Subjectivity at its fullness becomes the universe. not ever looking from the outside. Quote here. Oh, sorry, that there was a much longer quote on this other one. We'll come back to it if we need to. Okay, this was all for this previous quote. I'll just let you look at this a little bit, and then I'll. You may protest here that it says in this verse that limited subjects have sequence. Can't see this, but the Shiva archetype does not. In reply, he says, because of the universality of the subject, i.e. the subject who resides in the limited mind-bound entity is the same as the subject, which is Shiva. Sure. So if this limited subject can have time and sequence, surely Shiva can as well. Okay, and so Abhinav says there also, in fact, the presence of sequence or time is proved. Okay. Okay, so that's this quote here. Let's go on. So this section goes against those who want to put the absolute completely beyond the reach of time. Abhinav says this is okay as a teaching for bound souls, okay, but it's not really the truth, okay. So he tells us this here. He said in this here, he says, however, with regard to those who are, with reference to those who are to be instructed and who are limited, then it's okay to tell them that if you transcend into a place beyond time, but it's not the truth. Okay, so that's the gist of this long quote here. So subjectivity at its fullness becomes the universe, not ever looking from the outside. It indeed is the body of all things. Okay, what this means is that there is no transcendent viewpoint outside the universe to look down at it. What this also means is that things are not predetermined. There is no plan or fate already ordained, impervious to our frantic efforts while we just go through the motions. The freedom, svatantriya, tied to subjectivity has genuine creative effects, as we saw above, even for an insect scurrying away from the boot about to crush it from above. Yes, karma entails that some things have a statistically higher probability of happening, but still the system itself is sensitive to the finite expressions of subjectivity of even an insect with this dynamic expression of a cosmopsychic eye. I think Lynn Rudder-Baker puts the distinction nicely when she says, there's a quote from her, Descartes' resolution to regard himself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no senses is not a thought that Descartes could have had if it had been true. A transcendent, that's the end of her quote, a transcendent point of view beyond the body is simply a third person displacement, forgetting the condition of awareness, one's own body, while still relying on it. She gets at this point from another angle when she responds to Mark Johnson's critique of the self as illusory. Johnson says that because he can imagine being Spinoza, that feat threatens, this is a quote from him, the idea that I denotes the likes of Johnson. Okay, so Baker's response, she says, Johnson is not imagining the state of affairs that he thinks he is imagining. Johnson shifts to a third person state of affairs when he imagines himself, not as himself, but as Spinoza. Baker astutely notes that while she can imagine being like Spinoza and playing the roles in life that Spinoza played, her own first person perspective always entails Lynn Rudder-Baker engaging in this imagination. Subjectivity is always immanent. Abhinava and Utpaladeva also tackle the problem. How does a yogi read the mind of another person? Does she do it probing from the outside to know a person's inmost thoughts? As Raffaella Torella points out, for Utpaladeva, the yogi reads another person's mind not as an object separate from their own selves. Rather, the only means of knowing them is self-awareness. Utpaladeva elaborates, cognitions belonging to other subjects, which can be known only through self-awareness, must always be manifested as resting on their own self. Utpaladeva's insistence that occult knowledge, reading the mind of another, is centered on one's own self, forms a kind of limit case. That is, if we buy into the idea that a yogi can read another person's mind in the first place, then this clearly locates knowledge outside of the first person perspective. Instead, for Utpaladeva and Abhinavagupta, it works differently. The yogi's own subjectivity expands to embrace the thoughts of some other person as one's own. In this case, Johnson might perhaps imagine himself as Spinoza, but he would still also be Johnson here. And if he were an especially skilled yogi who could, with intense imagination, bhavana, actually become Spinoza, then it would still be Johnson, an expanded cosmological Johnson encompassing both Mark Johnson of the 21st century and the 17th century Spinoza. His own first-person perspective as Johnson does not disappear. Thus, for Baker and for Utpaladeva's mind-reading yogis, any knowledge we come by comes through one's own first-person awareness. Thus, to the extent that all subjectivity is embedded within a particular first-person perspective, it is tied to time and place, to immanence. We only leave behind time and place when we shift to the third person. For Abhinava, this means there can be no time-free transcendent deity. With this, he essentially purges from the idea of divinity a timeless foundation. And indeed, he tells us the very idea of a timeless transcendence is simply a useful teaching tool for folks caught in the grip of Maya, those confused about the nature of self. To conclude, beginning with Anil Seth's invocation of wonder as a consolation prize, we've charted its formulation within the keen phenomenological eye of these medieval Indian thinkers. Okay, tying wonder to the body, to sensory enjoyment, and to the intentionality of will, they argue we can find a foundational subjectivity within matter. Wonder, its expansive joy, its upward rush, signals this subjectivity at the heart of matter. And with Anil Seth and the Scientific American, these thinkers would indeed affirm wonder as the antidote to a mechanistic materialism. Antidote, I suggest, precisely because it discloses the presence of subjectivity within material form, beckoning us away from the third person back to the first person. Matter, in juxtaposition with wonder, at least briefly while we savor the wonder, manages to elude the manipulations of a mindset that threatens to reduce it to mere discardable objects. Indeed, threatens to reduce us as well to objects, to mere algorithms to manipulate. The astute phenomenological analysis of these thinkers may, I hope, prove helpful as we chart our own way in our world today through rethinking our relationship to materiality. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was very rich, and you luckily, well, you, like Abhinav Gupta, you haven't transcended time and have ended just perfectly. So we've got about 10 minutes, and we have a few questions in the Slido, and I've got loads of questions. And in fact, I mean, it was extremely rich, and I'm definitely going to have to read deeply into your book to answer a few of my many questions. But I'm going to restrict myself to a couple before turning to the Slido. So. I mean, I was wondering, of course, throughout about the relationship between this concept of chamatkara and yogic experience, or, you know, for the want of better term, spiritual experience, more broadly understood. I think you identified chamatkara wonder as with Turiya as Abhinav Gupta explained it, but I was wondering whether Abhinav Gupta would do that, and if I understood that correctly, or yeah. Otherwise, why did you bring Turiya in? That wasn't quite clear to me.
Right. Well, I think wonder itself is actually a deeper term than simply Turiya. It's just that what I have identified as this sort of transcendent phenomenology that we think about in terms of wonder is that is connected to the idea of chamatkara, but chamatkara for Abhinav Gupta actually sort of tends to encompass the totality. So it's the Turiya state brings us into this beginning of what we think of as transcendence. But as Abhinav, as you saw in the quote, Abhinav says it's like artificial gold. Okay, you take gold and you cover it over copper. It's not the whole deal. Chamatkara will be the whole deal. Okay. So, but it's an initial state that allows us to actually start to think more deeply about the nature of subjectivity and hence wonder.
Okay, so on that, so you're saying that if chamatkara encompasses it all, I was wondering, you talked about chamatkara arising, for example, from taste of food. Are there different grades of chamatkara, or is chamatkara all one?
No, these are good questions. Shomakara, I think he would say is really just one, okay? But because there are different grades of subjectivity, and because we're also on a continuum in our own capacity to experience our subjectivity, it appears to be different grades. You know, so for instance, yeah. So, you know, so for instance, well, it'll take a little while to think of a really good example, but there are different grades of humans.
Sure, no, that makes good sense. Okay, and I've got various more, but I better turn to the turn to the list. And so first up, the only non-anonymous one is Lubomir, our centre member. So if we could go to Lubomir. Is that going to happen?
Yes, I hope. Yeah,
Hello.
thanks for your, as Jim said, extremely rich talk, and I would like to ask a couple of specific questions. But just now, I have one very, I would say, general and simple, I hope, question. It's how do you understand transcendence? I mean, in the context of Pratyabhijna or Trika philosophy, what transcendence for you? Or in other words, can we even talk about transcendence in the system where, as we know, sarvam sarvatmakam, everything is everything in the last analysis, and the individual I, in fact, is the supreme I, and it's nothing but Shiva's consciousness, etc., etc. So, what's your understanding on using of transcendence in the context of Abhinav's Trika philosophy?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And because I think what you're pointing to is that really this philosophy is really wants us to get that there is no such thing as moving up and out. We don't really transcend. So that's a really good question. Now, I think that the way Abhinava understands it is connected to this idea of Turiya, that it's a phenomenological experience, okay, that we associate, like, I think what's happening here is that we have a phenomenological experience, which is, we call, you know, the wonder, the transcendence that comes with wonder. Medieval world and Abhinava has it as well. Medieval Europe has it as well. There's a long section in the book that I didn't even touch on here, where I do a little bit of a comparative analysis between what, you know, medieval Europeans thought wonder meant, what what words they use in Latin, etc., what these Indians mean and what we mean today. And I think that what they all share is a core feeling of this rising up out of the egoic identity. Okay, so that's the thing that wonder, I think, points that transcendence points to, is this sort of rising up out of an egoic identity. Now, as you rightly point out, for Abhinava's system, what he's, I think, trying to do is that rising up and out, it's a yogic spiritual experience, okay, and it's an experience that people like, and it's an experience that people sort of associate with having gotten somewhere in their yogic practice, okay? And that what Abhinava wants to do is, I think he wants to tell us that, but, you know, pay attention to this experience, because it's actually not what you think it is. It's not like what Shankara says, which is that you're going to then leave behind the materiality of the world and go to this great place that's pristine. Instead, he's saying that, no, what's really happening here is, let's reinterpret this. Abhinava is saying, let's reinterpret it as actually going inward to an inward subjectivity. Okay, so that's what he does, and I think that's the major move that he makes. That they're all talking about a particular kind of experience that I think most of us have had here as well. If you haven't had this experience, please do raise your hand and ask a question, okay? Or if you have, okay. But but this is a common kind of experience, I think, and I think a lot of times we do certain kinds of, all over the world, where people will do religious types of practices just to get that experience, whether it's yoga or going to church or whatever. That kind of experience, I think, is something that humans like, and that it does take us out of the transcendence part of it, takes us out of an egoic identity. But Abhinava says it brings us actually inward to a deeper sense of I. Now, again, I think it's important that the quote that he gives us, that the ego is not that this I, hanta, is not an adversary of the ego. So it's not a battle. It's actually just a sort of, making more full, a reflection of something that's actually greater in that sense. So yeah, but really good question. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the remaining questions are anonymous. So I'm going to read them out. At the top here is, I'm thinking, what would be Abhinav Gupta's reply to the hard problem of consciousness, the most popular theory among neuroscientists these days? Your thoughts, and I expect you've got some because that's right up your street, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Okay, all I can say is, you should read my book. And it's going to come out. If you're really, really desperate, send me an email and I'll send you different parts of it, which will sort of cover. I talk about it mostly in one chapter in particular, the chapter on Vimarsha, the hard part. So if you're really, really desperate to find out today, or then you can go ahead and email me. But really, go ahead, please read the book. Because he does actually have his own solution. In a nutshell, the solution is that he basically takes, he basically says it has to do with what I pointed out here, and that is he links subjectivity to matter. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. He links subjectivity to matter, not to consciousness. It is to consciousness, yes, but we have this sort of dual reality of consciousness and matter. And what Abhinav does is he takes subjectivity and he puts it on the side of he puts it on subjectivity on the same side as matter. And when he does that, he basically collapses the system. And the hard problem that's how he takes care of the hard problem. But whoever sent it, if you are really, if you can't wait until the book comes out, let me know and I'll send you at least that one chapter. Okay, so you can get a good sense of that answer.
Thanks. And we've got time, maybe one, possibly two more, but I mean, these are all such big questions that it's hard for you to rattle them, answer them very quickly. The next one is, it's said generally that Hinduism and its branches are followers of polytheism. How then can we understand pantheism idea of Hinduism and Tantra? Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, good question. So polytheism, I think that, so Abhinav Gupta, I argue, is a panentheist. Okay, so what does that mean? It's not, he's not a pantheist, he's not a panpsychist. He actually does, I think, ascribe to an idea that that there is a sort of consciousness which is actually able to sort of have a kind of awareness above and beyond the whole. Okay. And in one of the chapters in the book later, I do talk about the problems with his panentheism, like what the weaknesses of that particular system for him philosophically. Okay, so polytheism, I think that in Hinduism generally, you almost always find not a simple polytheism. I think that you almost always find something closer to a panentheism, which is that most systems are at least striving somewhat towards a unity of things, either very hard-lined panentheism where the divinity contains the whole, but is separate in some forms of Vaishnavism, where the self is actually, where the individual person, the Vyakti, is actually not the same as the cosmic God, or like Abhinav Gupta's, where there is this idea of a divine being, but that you're actually indivisible from that divine being. That's a form of panentheism. Okay, and you could sort of chop up that panentheism to greater or lesser inclinations towards non-dualism or dualism. Okay, so that you're separate from divinity or you're the same as divinity. But I don't, so polytheism, I think, is not, maybe the Greeks were, I don't know, but I think in India in general, its polytheism is much richer and usually a form of panentheism in that respect. Hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to follow up. Yeah. Okay,
great. Thanks. Well, actually, we've reached 8:15, and there's a couple more questions, but again, they would probably require whole books, and you'd probably so I think I might just leave them there. And we'll say thank you very much. That was extremely rich, extremely enjoyable, and I think we'll all be rushing out to buy your book or emailing you for PDFs if
okay.
sections.
It's always the option.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, over to you, Theo. Then thanks.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks a lot, Loriliai. Could you possibly email me kind of if you've got a link to the book in terms of publication, and we can send that out to people as well? That would be really good. Yeah, so we can help publicize that for you. Yeah, thank you for a fantastic talk, which I'm sure everyone really enjoyed. In the moment, I'll ask everyone to unmute themselves and thank themselves, and thank you personally. We don't include that bit on the YouTube in case anybody's wondering or worrying about how untidy their living room is or whatever. But just to point out, our next talk is with Chris Chappell on the 15th of November on 5-element meditations. That one is proving wildly popular. So if you're registered for it and you know you can't make it, can you unregister so that we know we've got some spaces? That would be great. But yes, thank you again, Loriliai. That was brilliant, and we'll see everyone soon, hopefully.